Hello, friends. Welcome back to Eliminate the Gap here. And we're joined today by Donald Earl Collins, everybody. And Donald, he's a professor. He's done some writing. We're very excited to have Donald today. Donald, we'd like to talk all things education with you here, but we only have a certain amount of time. Uh, Welcome, first of all. But I'm gonna kick this thing off. Start right off with our first question here. So, given everything education's been through in the past 2 or 3 years with the coronavirus, distance learning, things of that nature, like what percent do you feel we are now currently back to normal?
First of all, thanks for having me, Eric. Thanks for having me, Delmar. I appreciate it. You guys, we kind of go back a way, so it's great for you to have me on. First of all, um, on that question though, the question for me is, what is normal? I mean, really, what is normal?
Sure.
I mean, if we're talking about before the pandemic, where students were struggling with student achievement issues, where people were complaining about SROs and how they all too frequently crack down on Black and brown kids, if we're talking about a period of time where high stakes testing and the stressors and the mental health issues associated with that for zillennials around anxiety and all those other things, then we're 100% back to normal if we go by that definition,
That's
right?
true. That's true.
Really think
Sure.
about it, right? I mean, but if we're talking about where we have an education system that's working for people, that's keeping people feeling like they're safe, not just in terms of catching, COVID-19 or its variants, but in terms of like this is a safe space for them to learn. This is a safe space for them to um, basically deal with whatever issues they're having, whether it's mental health related, hunger, or whatever the other issues that schools tend to have to deal with in this day and age, then we're maybe 10% normal, maybe 20, right? So it depends on how you look at what normal is. But if normal has been toxic, then do we really want to go back to that? I don't think so. I mean, that's what I'm thinking anyway, right? So
Right,
yeah,
right.
so I think we need to think about what normal is, right? And what normal has been normal has been very abnormal and very toxic for years, for generations actually. And so maybe with the pandemic, we've learned a little bit about how these things can be exacerbated by having a pandemic and distance learning and online learning and all of that. But at the same time, we already have articles by people like Melinda D. Anderson, who's written a lot about this the last 2 years, about the fact that Black parents, Latinx parents feel better about their kid learning at home because they're not dealing with the microaggressions that go on at school every day. Even the majority of those kids, when asked, have said, "Yeah, this is great. I'd rather do this than go back to school every day and have to deal with the teacher who doesn't really like me, who never calls on me when I raise my hand, or a teacher just assumes I don't know anything because because they hear me speak more Spanish than English kinds of things, right?" So I think we have to think about what was normal wasn't really normal. I mean, unless you like dystopian types of situations like going to school. I mean, that's all. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah. And not surprising, as Delmar mentioned, we're going to try to cover as many things as possible, and I think you brought up most of them in the first question, which is awesome. So no, but the reality is we never pretend to try to be the expert in any of this, right? What we want
Mhm.
to do is encourage conversation and dialogue, and hopefully for our listeners to be able to take away from it, learn something, maybe do some additional research, all of those kinds of things. That's really kind of what we're here to do. That said, I am going to put you a little on the hot seat. It's not that hot, really. Um, and just say, I mean, you brought up so many challenges, right? And honestly, this podcast got its start from Delmar and I and some others really talking about the need for a lot of things to change in education. Delmar's a high school teacher, has been for more than 15 years. I've been working in and around young people for that long, if not longer. The reality is there are a lot of things broken you just highlighted. So let me just allow you to maybe go deep on what you think, Donald Earl Collins, to what do we need to do to maybe solve one of those, What is it that we kind of need to, take from your lead here and kind of see what we can do to improve?
This is something I talk about a lot in my education classes, whether undergrad over the years or in previous iterations of grad courses. What do we do? Well, you have to understand that education is just one institution, one system in a larger system known as the American society. And American society has all these gaps and issues and inequalities, right? You have all these inequalities, Eric. If you have all these inequalities, Delmar, you can't expect schools to solve the problem. The super teacher to swoop in somehow and change the lives of young people so that they go on to do whatever they're doing. Well, that doesn't work if they're still hungry, right? That doesn't work if they're still dealing with trauma because their neighborhood has a relatively high crime rate and they actually know people who've been shot and killed, right? Actually seen some of this in their own lifetime. So really, it's not just up to education, but if you just want to deal with one problem, which is mental health, there are simpler ways to deal with this. And one of them is to not use schools as a billionaire's philanthropic experiment every 3 to 5 years, so that we do more testing, more time teachers to test, time students to test to see how well they're achieving, to close an achievement gap. I didn't know that was the best way to close an achievement gap, is to basically test people more, right? I thought the best way to maybe you work with them on their weaknesses so that their weaknesses become strengths over time. Maybe sometimes less is more. Maybe less testing is necessary, right? There's all this high stakes testing, putting teachers putting them on a true hot seat where their jobs are on the line every year if they don't get student scores up, even though all the research shows that they can't really get student scores up. That would help with the mental health a bit, I would think. It won't solve all the problems, but that's a start, right? If you're just dealing with that one issue alone, right? Where you're not constantly testing students all the time. And using diagnostic tests, by the way, which are supposed to diagnose where the gaps are, right? Not
Right.
calling them standardized tests to basically try to show that students have achieved more over time. We have a nutty system when it comes to these kinds of things. It's freaking nutty. I mean, seriously. I mean, Delmar, you've been teaching this. You know what this is like, teaching to
Most definitely.
test, right? I mean, so,
Most definitely.
does it help your mental health at all? I'm asking a serious question
No,
here. Does it help?
you're 100% correct. I mean, man, that is 100% correct.
I mean,
That to kind of piggyback kind of what you're saying there, like that's kind of been the emphasis for probably the past 20 years now, at least, since we
mhm.
brought in this whole what is it, the high stakes testing that we brought into our legislation.
Yeah, no child gets ahead, right? I think that's what it's called, right?
Yeah.
So,
Oh man.
think about it. If you have all those stressors, how well can you possibly learn? How well can you possibly teach? How well can you how can you feel okay in a system that basically has you under the gun all the time, right? Maybe that's one of the stressors that causes students to act out in ways where you over police them, right? Maybe maybe if we change that up a bit, I'm not saying it would get back to some normalcy, but that would be helpful. That's a start, you know?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And we're going to get a little bit more into some of the that aspect of it here in a bit. But it's funny and not so funny, honestly. You mentioned mental health and the importance of that, and yet almost every night on any local newscast, you can not hear about mental health and how the local school board is trying to tackle that. Instead, they're talking about lots of other divisive issues like critical race theory. Delmar and I, in preparing for this episode, read your recent article on Al Jazeera around critical race theory, and in particular, just how scary it's been and how divisive it's been, and so on and so forth. And one of the things, before you kind of give us some thoughts there, help us even understand what is meant by critical race theory, because I think a lot of folks don't even really understand it.
Well, thanks for asking me that question. I think a lot of folks don't understand it because, well, you're not supposed to understand it. It's kind of high level theory, right? I mean,
Right.
I mean, no one asks people to understand like quantum theory, right? Quantum mechanics and the quantum universe that goes with it, right? Quantum physics, right? You don't ask people what are the 248 different vector particles there are within the quantum world, right? As part of quantum theory, you don't do that, right? I mean, because the average person's not going to know that. I mean, seriously, no one's going to know that. So why would you expect something that is taught mostly in law schools, mostly in upper level? I mean, like senior thesis level courses in sociology, in history, and other fields to be something that everyone will know about. That's why it's a scam. That's why it's a freaking scam. When you think about what these legislatures and school districts are doing and banning books and, saying we don't want to hear the word race and racism come up. Don't teach this stuff. They're not talking about critical race theory. They're talking about Black history. They're talking about Black history and culture. They're talking about the histories of people, of Americans of color across the country. And the fact that a lot of these school boards don't want to upset as I say in another piece that I've been working on, the Jacks and Jills of the country and their parents over, oh my God, they're upset because they're learning about the impact of racism on their classmates for the first time in their lives. Well, my point really is that, gee, put the shoe on the other foot here for a second. What do you think it's like for a Black kid to learn about racism for the first time in school? What do you think it's first, when you learn as a woman of color, or excuse me, a girl of color, or even the white girl, in elementary school, that you won't be called on nearly as much over time because, sexism, right? These are traumatic events for students who are marginalized. So a student who has privilege can't afford to learn about, this sort of stuff too. Now there are better ways to kind of teach this stuff, right? There are ways to teach this so that it can't be as traumatizing, but it should be uncomfortable. How do people learn? Do people learn when everything feels good all the time? Do you learn how to catch do you learn how to catch a football or throw a football or knock someone on their butt playing football by just simply, oh yeah, that was an okay throw. It's 5 yards away from where you're trying to go with it, but it's okay. No, you gotta get better at this stuff. And sometimes that means trauma. Sometimes that means discomfort, right? And these are ugly things to learn about American society, by the way. So the critical race theory thing is literally just a catch-all phrase created by the Heritage Foundation as part of a larger campaign to undermine public schools. You can look this up. This is not conspiracy theory. There are plenty of articles about it. If you want to dive down a rabbit hole, go ahead. But my point is that this is a well-crafted far-right push to basically make public schools look like an enemy because their ultimate goal is to destroy public schools. To bring in enough charter schools, enough private entities, particularly private religious, meaning Christian in this case, entities, to basically replace the public schools that we have. And all of these efforts, when you're talking about don't say gay, when you're talking about critical race theory, they're about that larger issue. They don't care if the kids are traumatized or not. They're already passing legislation to traumatize kids who are queer. Let's be honest, they just passed pieces of legislation in Alabama around all of this. So, this is nothing to do with critical race theory. We still have to deal with the reality that that's what people think that this part of this is, but it's not about that. It's about, being able to teach histories, heritages, cultures that make other people, particularly white folks, uncomfortable. I mean,
Yeah.
am I right or wrong on that? I mean, that's how I mean, I have people come after me saying I'm anti-patriotic, but other than that, am I wrong?
Well, here's kind of what you saying all that, what I really kind of boiled this down to is really we should be, even with your first statements, we should be teaching young people to think, right?
Right.
And that's it at the end of the day, that, truth is truth, and we can draw truth out of things if we teach kids to teach logically, or to think logically rather. So that's kind of, and that should be the impetus of education in general. And kind of thinking about what we were talking about earlier, you had mentioned around the testing and things. One of the challenges facing us today has been around, or us as teachers, is the function of grading and evaluation. And we've had many attempts and measures to measure student achievement and learning accurately. But what are your thoughts on some of the practices when it comes to grading and assessments?
Well, I've gotten to the point. I mean, I've always hated grading. I can tell you that. Whether I was 21, 22 years old as a TA in graduate school teaching sections of U.S. history, or now at 52,
Yeah.
right, teaching my 98th course, which is actually true. I'm at 96, 97, 98 this semester. I'll hit 100 this summer.
Awesome.
It's dubious, thank you. Right. It's also, it's kind of like, why am I doing this? What purpose does it serve? It doesn't really tell me what students have learned. I tell students this all the time, but students are so wrapped up in their grade oftentimes that, if it's anything other than an A, I mean an A, not even an A minus, just if it's not an A, right? They're finding failings in themselves. They're finding things about me that, well, you're not the perfect professor either. You're arrogant and you expect us to know this stuff. I'm like, well, that's kind of my job, right? Not the arrogant part, but to make sure
Right.
you know this stuff. And
Expected
make
to
sure,
know.
yeah, and by the way, that I should know this stuff. What, I was like supposed to go, I'm not sure about anything that I'm teaching, so let me just throw it out there and see if you like it or not. No, that's not how this works, right? And we spent years learning all this stuff, so I'm trying to impart it to you so that you don't have to spend years learning this stuff either, right? I mean, you get paid for. So anyway, my point is that, I mean, one of the things I've learned over the years is that the grading system that most of us still have, forget about for the moment the newest of grading systems, which I think you're going to ask me about later, but just in general, the A to F or A to E grading system has only been around since the mid 1930s. Did you know that? It's only
Yeah,
been around
I
for
do.
80
I've had
years.
many conversations
It hasn't,
around one of
yeah, it
my
hasn't been
peers
around,
about
but,
this.
but but most people think it's been around forever. This forever thing that people love to say. It hasn't been around that long, right? There are ways to grade people, and there's schools that still do this. Not public schools, private schools do this. University of California at Santa Cruz for a time did this. I don't know if they still do or not, but there's qualitative grading where you literally write out what the student did well, what the student needs to improve on, what the student did improve on over the course of their time in your course. Their writing skills, those sorts of things, right? It's not just did they meet some standard. It's literally just you as a teacher giving a qualitative evaluation of each and every individual student in that course. Maybe it's 3 sentences, maybe it's a full paragraph, but some sort of evaluation that says this student actually learned something. That's what lots of schools used to do until we got caught up in grading. And then with high stakes testing and everything else that's come on since the mid 1990s, we've gotten to the point where, okay, how do we make people more comfortable with grading? I mean, I don't know if you guys remember what Montgomery County tried to do with K through 5 a few years back. We have this assessment which I called ESPN, which is actually known as ESPIN, where right, where you had these levels of grading which wasn't tied to A, B, C, D, E, or F, or whatever combination they were using. So you had to basically be, proficient was one level, the I was basically average. I forget what I means. E was for excellent or exceeding expectations, exceeding proficient. Well, last I checked, proficient means that you have a certain degree of mastery of the materials to begin with. So how do you exceed proficient? How many grade levels do you have to be above to to exceed proficient at this point, right? In my mind, as a grader, proficient means a B or a B plus student. That's pretty good. I feel pretty good about that. But nope, we got
Yeah.
to have a system that has to have exceed so that 12% of students can feel like that they're gifted, right? And I, I have lots of problems with grading, but the main thing I have problems with that's so tied to testing these days that it it almost becomes like you're creating an artificial bubble of competition that you need not create, right? Students can compete with each other without you creating all these other wonderfully toxic ways to like evaluate them. That,
Right.
yeah. So I think we need more qualitative types of approaches and less quantitative types of approaches. We have at this point reams and reams of meaningless data, right? That tell us what we already know. They tell us what we already know. That's the main problem with the data. It doesn't tell us anything different. It's not like all of a
Right.
sudden you figured out, hey, Delmar, you can be a better teacher if you do X, Y, and Z. You can't get that from the data. And neither can I. From grading, you can't get and evaluate. You can't
Right.
get that from the quantitative data that's out there.
Right.
Not really. They think they
Yeah.
can, but so
Yeah, but not adequately
yeah.
to be able to really, put your thumb on this right here is where, and I get it. So, kind of to piggyback off of that, man, one of these shifts that's been occurring is the standards-based grading. That's kind of one of the big pushes right now, and it's been one of those gradual waves, and I think once the shutdown happened, it kind of lost a little momentum, but I think it's starting to come back now. Like, do you believe this is an answer to increase student mastery, and why?
No, I don't. I feel like as you know, Eric, as you know, Delmar, schools go through 3 to 5 year cycles of trying different things. Let's try this. Let's try this. Because and parents generally in most public school systems these days pretty much agree with whatever the school initially tries, because whatever will work to get my kid to be better at school, they're willing to go with it until
Right.
it shows it won't work, and they're like, "Oh my God, this crap doesn't work. Let's get rid of it. Try something else." And then there comes another new set of things. Yeah, no, it doesn't work, and here's why. It would be different if it was just a diagnostic tool. If you are using 1, 2, 3, and 4 to show levels of mastery and as a diagnostic tool, fine. But if you're going to tie it again to testing, to year-end evaluations through testing, to evaluation of teachers through testing and students, then no, it's not a good tool. Because again, you're creating the same situation that you were creating with just A, B's, and C's, and D's, and E's, or F's, as the case may be. Same thing with ESPIN in Montgomery County between 2013 and 14, or between 2013 and 2018, right? And in other cases, what you're creating is a system where, because you are tying it to testing, because you're tying this to the larger theme of trying to make sure that that evaluating that you are essentially, if a student doesn't achieve mastery, you are essentially blaming them for not achieving mastery. And again, we're talking mastery here. We're not talking, do they understand the concept, but have occasional trouble calculating the answer, because even though they might understand like the larger processes along the vision, they just sometimes put down the number 3 instead of 4, right? Students do these kinds of things. Does that
Mhm.
mean they
Yeah,
don't
let's
understand the
do that.
concept?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
That goes back
No,
to that thumb on there, right?
yeah, yeah. And so kind of like, wait a minute. Eh, No, no, this is the problem is we're constantly using diagnostic processes to try to do formative and summative evaluations and assessments of students, right? And if you're doing if I mean, let's put it this way. If you diagnose somebody with, say, dyslexia, would the first thing you do would be, hey, let's turn that into a test so that they can overcome dyslexia? Of course you wouldn't. You know why? Because that's a process. That's a process. You don't just go, well, he didn't overcome dyslexia in 6 months, so there's a gap issue, right? No, that's something that you work on with somebody until they can figure out a coping mechanism for themselves in order to deal with the fact that they sometimes don't process letters in the way that most people are able to, right? You don't do that with this. What you're trying to do, yes, you can have a standard around mastery. I mean, we can talk about why the standards themselves are flawed in a minute, but you can have standards around mastery, right? But the ultimate goal is to help students get to the point where they can walk that path themselves without without intervention. And so that means working with students in a more directive way, whether it's with reading or with math or, other ways to help them get to that point, but not to just test them on it. I mean, that's the problem I have with that.
So I have a quick question. As we were coming on here, you were mentioning that you were grading, right? And so I expect, I imagine that you have to turn in grades that are in the A, B, C, D, whatever. That's my assumption. You can tell me in a moment I'm wrong. My question is, with all that you've said about assessing students and how to quote unquote grade them, what is it that you're doing? And then do you have to then put it in, after you've assessed how somebody's doing, do you then convert it to this kind of structure that maybe you don't agree with?
Absolutely, Eric. I absolutely do have that. I do have to have that. I mean, this sort of conversation with myself about what my universities expect from me and what I'm actually doing. One of the things I adopted about 4 or 5 years ago, at least when I teach at American University, is ungrading. It's a process that I've been thinking about doing for years. At my other university, University of Maryland Global Campus, they won't let me do it. So I'm stuck using their rubrics and their methodologies for doing things, right? I hate it, but I can't. There's nothing I can do about it. But where I can do stuff is with ungrading, and this is the person who's the real guru for this at the university level is Jesse Stommel, Stommel, Jesse. He basically started implementing it in his classrooms about 10 or 15 years ago, and it's made so much of a difference in terms of his own teaching. I've been thinking about doing this without reading his stuff first, right? Because I've been thinking about this because I knew teachers who ungraded too as early as 2012, but there was no way I could get it in. Once I started teaching at AU, American University, I started using it, and it's mostly had really, really good results. And the idea here is simple. It's a 360-degree process, so students do some self-evaluation over the course of the semester. They write reflections on what they've learned, including personal reflections about what they've learned and whether it had any impact on them. I do qualitative evaluations of papers, of projects, of their project work, and give them back to them so that they can work to improve on those things. So it's not just here's a paper, here's a grade, that's it. Here's a paper, here's my assessment of it. Go back and try to do this again, using what I've actually asked you to do. Right. So it's not 6 papers. You might get 1 or 2 papers a semester and you'll have 1 project, and that's it. And then, if you're working on, second drafts and third drafts or things, you're trying to implement the things that I'm saying. And there's peer review as part of this process. So your peers get to read your stuff too, and give you feedback on it as well. Read your projects or watch your projects as the case, and give you assessments on that as well. And so the whole process is meant so that by the time I sit down and give you a grade, I don't have much of a choice but to get, if you do everything, you're probably going to get an A or an A minus, right? So in terms of how I translate, because I'm not looking at, well, if you're a really, really great student, here's a net. Some of that's true. Great students will do well regardless of what format you use. But if you have students who are improving over the course of the semester, even if they don't initially understand what's going on, how can I not give them an A or an A minus? How can I not assign them a high grade? Because they've done the work, right? And they've improved tremendously. And so that point, when it has worked well, right? Very, very well. Some students don't buy in, and that's an issue. Because at the college, it's an issue because they're adults. You know, to some extent, if you don't buy in, that's up to you. I mean, I can't make you buy in, but if you don't buy in, there are consequences, right? So one of those is that, okay, did they improve over the course of the semester? No. Did they do all the work they were supposed to do? No. Did they heed my recommendations and suggestions for what they could do to improve? No. Well, that's not an A or an A minus. It's something else, maybe a B plus, maybe a B, depending on what they did. Maybe in some cases it's even lower than that. But for the most part, most of my students do well under this kind of thing as long as they buy in, right?
Yeah.
Now, some of them won't because they're still tied to this, I want an A, I want an A. And I'm like, wake up, it's not about A's, it's about learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what I do to try to accommodate that. It's more work initially, but by the time I get to the final stages, I'm not tearing my hair out reading stuff because I know the students made a lot of improvement in most cases. So, that's how I look. That's how I try to deal with it anyway. I mean, I'm assuming both of you've heard of ungrading as a method.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. Well, thanks a lot, Donald, man. We've had a great time. This has been some great discussion, and man, it's given some pause and reflection even for myself there in regards to some of the stuff, which is always good to have. So yeah, man, we really appreciate your thoughts and your time here today.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions. I mean, after the year that we've had with yo-yo, education between being online, being in person, mask this week, no mask this week, mask again. AU just went back to mask mandate yesterday after a month of telling us we could walk around without wearing masks, and I'm like, I never took my masks off. What are you talking about? Right? But anyway, right? So yeah, especially after this year, it's good to know that, okay, I'm not crazy. The things that I've been doing are actually normal things to be doing as a teacher, as an educator. So it's good to know that, and if nothing else.
No, we greatly appreciate it, Donald. Thanks for the time. And man, there's a lot here that we can uncover, and actually probably need to schedule a part 2 at some point, because there's some areas here that definitely deserve more time.
Okay. Well, it sounds great to me.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Delmar.